Section 2. Deconstructing Free Will, Explaining. As a consequence, Wegener says, intention is normally understood as an idea of what one is going to do that appears in consciousness just before one does it. This is the thought that people usually associate most strongly with causing the action, end quote. Wegener then proceeds to deconstruct this, as he sees it, popular delusion. He says that, quote, it's tempting to think that the conscious experience of will is a direct perception of the force of will, end quote. To refute this, he starts with Hume's insistence that causality is not inherent in objects. For instance, when we see a bowling ball smashing into pins, it seems as though the ball has a causal force, i.e., that the ball is the cause, and the explosive reaction of the pins is the effect. However, Hume pointed out that you can't see causation. You can only infer it from the constant relation between cause and effect. In other words, there is no causality nestled somewhere in the ball or hanging somewhere in space between the balls and the pins that somehow works this magic. Causation is an event, not a thing or a characteristic or an attribute of an object. In the same sense, says Wegener, causation can't be a property of a person's conscious intention. You can't see your conscious intention causing an action, but can only infer this from the constant relation between intention and action. Hume realized then that calling the will a force in a person's consciousness must always overreach what we can see or even introspect, and so should be understood as an inference. Wegener argues that the real cause sequence underlying human behavior involves a massively complicated set of mechanisms, quote, each of our actions is really the culmination of an intricate set of physical and mental processes. This is the empirical will. However, we don't see this. Instead, we readily accept a far easier explanation of our behavior. We intended to do it, so we did it, end quote. This tendency, Wegener claims, is part of a bigger picture, namely that human beings have two radically different systems of explanation, one for minds and one for everything else. Wegener is keen to emphasize that our feeling of doing on purpose is not empirical evidence of mental causation, quote. The experience of will is merely a feeling that occurs to a person. A conscious willing is still a conscious willing even when it is illusory. It may not be the cause of an action of which it is the apparent cause. A person's feeling of will and the associated report of this experience to others is a key criterion commonly used for assessing whether conscious will has operated. But we must remember that this feeling is not the same as an empirically verifiable occurrence of mental causation. Wegener's argument is that the concept of causal agency is based on this feeling of willing and the fact that it generally coincides with action. This experience is the ultimate basis for notions of intentions, beliefs, desires, and plans, and the interpretations of the behavior of others based upon them. As Wegener says, quote, "The intuitive appeal of the idea of conscious will can be traced in part to the embedding of the experience of will and of the notion that will has a force in the larger conception of causal agency. People appear to be goal-seeking agents who have the special ability to envision their goals consciously in advance of action. The experience of conscious will feels like being a conscious agent," end quote. Wegener suggests that, quote, "Each person has two general lenses through which to view causality: a mechanical causality lens for objects and a mental causality lens for agents. The illusion of conscious will may be a misapprehension of the mechanistic causal relations underlying our own behavior that comes from looking at ourselves by means of a mental explanatory system. We don't see our own gears turning because we're busy reading our minds," end quote. This tendency to view the world in two ways has created in us two largely incompatible ways of thinking. Quote, "When we apply mental explanations to our own behavior causation mechanisms, we fall prey to the impression that our conscious will causes our actions. The fact is, we find it enormously seductive to think of ourselves as having minds, and so we are drawn into an intuitive appreciation of our own conscious will." Quote, "As Marvin Minsky concluded, none of us enjoys the thought that what we do depends on processes we do not know. We prefer to attribute our choices to volition, will, or self-control. Perhaps it would be more honest to say, my decision was determined by internal forces I do not understand," end quote.